Good evening, everybody. My name is Jill Zippin, and I am the chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania. Thank you for coming to this Zoom today. I want to thank all of our partners who are participating as a partner in this Zoom. I would like to thank Politics with Dana and Steve, Montgomery County Women's Leadership Initiative, PA Democratic Voter Outreach, and the Jewish Battleground Coalition. The Jewish Battleground Coalition is made up of Arizona, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Georgia, and of course, PA. So thanks to all of those who are working to make this event a success. This event will be moderated by Mitch Cates, and our featured speaker is Patty Satalia. I'm going to introduce both of them and then turn it over to Mitch. So Mitch Cates. Mitch Cates is a veteran political operative and consultant who has skillfully overseen local, statewide, and national campaigns in the U.S. and abroad for almost 20 years. He is currently the executive director of the PA Democratic Party. He was behind the successful candidacies of the former Prime Minister of Kosovo and the Republic of Georgia, as well as Justice David N. Weck's election to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. As the current executive director, he will bring home PA for all the Democrats in Pennsylvania up and down the ballot, making sure Harris Walz wins PA, not just for PA, but for the nation. No pressure, Mitch, whatsoever. I would also like to introduce to you our lead speaker, Patty Satalia. Before I introduce Patty, who is a former Penn State Public Broadcasting host and producer, I want to give a shout out to our friends in State College and the Center County Dems, where Patty is from. They helped us secure Patty as a speaker tonight. So shout out to all of you State College and Center County Democrats on this Zoom. As I said, Patty is a Penn State Public Broadcasting host and producer. During her time at WPSU, Satalia co-produced Conversations from Penn State, where she interviewed remarkable people, including Margaret Atwood and NFL Hall of Famer Harry Carson. She hosted other programs such as Take Note, Lobby Talk, and Pennsylvania Inside Out. Although she is well known for her interviews, she produced award-winning documentaries on a variety of topics. Prior to beginning her 30 years at WPSU, Satalia worked in Pittsburgh as a film editor and fill-in news anchor for WPGH-TV, and later for WPTT-TV as a public affairs director and co-host of the talk show People, Places, and Things. Patty, through her journalistic skills, has become one of the leading experts in the topic of Project 2025, and she has a wonderful presentation for us this evening. I'm going to turn it over now to Mitch, who's going to say a few words before Patty begins her presentation. Take it away, Mitch.
Thank you, Jill, for that kind introduction. You failed to point out, though, that I am a proud member and one of the vice chairs of DJOP as well. So I'm proud of that and being a part of that organization. And I'm incredibly proud to be a part of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. And for those of you that are Zooming in from all over the country, we want you to know that here in Pennsylvania, we have the largest field operation that's ever been assembled, and it continues to grow. The Pennsylvania Democratic Party will be executing our flagship program called Vote Local PA. It's the only program like it in the entire country, run by a state party. We are fiercely competitive. Our team is world-class, and we are going to make sure that we send Kamala Harris and Coach Walz to the White House. But we also have some work to do down ballot too, which is something we focus on. Before I turn this over to our guest speaker, Patty, I just want to say a couple of quick words. Number one, Patty was kind enough to join us back in June during our summer state committee meeting, where she was a special guest for one of the seminars that we presented to the members of state committee on the topic of Project 2025. What's interesting is that back then, there were not many people that knew what Project 2025 was. And while I know this election cycle has been like a twisting, turning mystery thriller of a campaign that every single week something different happens, it feels like it was 10 years ago when Patty did that presentation, and it was only a couple of months ago. And since then, you know, I do have to say that after her presentation, I got more requests from state committee members for the recording of that because they wanted to share it far and wide. And since then, we have seen the information about Project 2025 escalating both in the social networks. And for those of you that watched the remarkable DNC convention that many of us were at, it played a prominent role on every single night of that convention. What's fascinating about Patty's presentation, I'm not going to spoil it, is that she actually gives the history of who's involved, which is interesting to connect the dots of what their plan, the Trump-Vance plan is, and where it started and how far back it goes. This is a very maniacal thing that wasn't just created overnight. This has been something in the works for years. And so I think it's a fascinating conversation. I'm not going to say anything other. I just want to pass the microphone over to Patty, who will give you information on everything that you need to know about Project 2025. Thank you all for joining us.
Mute. Okay. Thanks so much, Mitch. And thanks everyone for being here and for inviting me here tonight. I should mention, first of all, that I am retired from Penn State Public Broadcasting. I retired about 6 years ago. I gave a version of this presentation for the first time in early January. It was to a well-read and well-informed, politically well-informed group in State College. And at the time, very few people at the meeting knew anything about Project 2025. Thankfully, as Mitch said, a lot has changed since then, because the only way to stop Project 2025 from being fully implemented, and I say fully implemented because parts of it have already taken shape, is education. So thank you so much for being here. The Heritage Foundation, yes, the conservative think tank some of you may remember from the Reagan administration, has published its manifesto, or policy Bible as they sometimes call it, and posted it online for the world to see. The man behind it, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, sent shockwaves through the country a few weeks ago when he praised the Supreme Court's bombshell ruling on presidential immunity during an appearance on Steve Bannon's War Rooms podcast. He talked with a substitute host because Bannon, you may remember, had just started his 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. Have a listen.
Come with a message of hopefulness, because we live at a time when the radical left, which I know something about, I'll tell you about how I got to know them as a young history professor, wants us to be discouraged. They want you to be sitting here in your tables right now and be despairing, not just about the future of America, which they hate, but they want you to be so despairing that you decide that you're no longer going to be politically active. And I'm here to tell you that now is the time, more than any other time in our lifetimes, to reject what the radical left wants you to be, which is to be discouraged, and instead dig ever deeper than we ever have before, because this is the year, 2024, when we take this country back.
Actually, I'm not sure that's the right one, and here's an excerpt from Robert's speech at the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference. It's the largest and longest running conference, conservative conference in the country. It was held in Harrisburg this past April.
But as you might imagine, I have a personal favorite, and that is, once and for all, We are going to eliminate, tear out, root and branch the most rotten part of the federal government, which is the U.S. Department of Education.
I think our clips are running in the wrong space, but Roberts sets the tone for Project 2025, and to be sure, it is a dark agenda. It's rife with bad ideas, and if enacted, it would inflict harm on myriad populations. The Forward, a Jewish newspaper published in Yiddish and English, says Project 2025 is, quote, very bad news for Jews. The Jewish Democratic Council of America sees it as a step toward authoritarianism, an erosion of freedom of religion, and the empowering of a Christian nationalist movement steeped in anti-Semitism. But let's start at the beginning. The Heritage Foundation was founded in 1973, that's 51 years ago, to push conservative business-friendly policies. Today, it's arguably the most powerful and influential right-wing think tank in Washington, D.C. Heritage helped staff and set the agenda for every Republican administration since Ronald Reagan. Reagan described Heritage as a vital force in, quote, the many successes of his presidency. By the end of Reagan's first year in office, he had implemented more than half of the 2,000 policy proposals that were written by Heritage. Now, let's fast forward. In 2015, Heritage leadership mocked Donald Trump's presidency, questioned his conservative credentials, and called him a clown. But candidate Trump pledged to consult Heritage on potential Supreme Court nominees. And when he won the White House in 2016, he delivered, nominating Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. According to author Michael Lewis, the Trump campaign, not expecting to win, hadn't even bothered to prepare an acceptance speech, let alone an action plan for taking over the reins of the federal government. Governor Chris Christie, you may remember, prepared transition binders that a senior Trump aide tossed into the garbage. By all accounts, Trump's presidential transition was a hot mess. Heritage swooped in, playing an outsized role in staffing Trump's administration. Some referred to it as a shadow transition team. In Trump's first year in office, he implemented nearly 64% of their policy recommendations, the most of any president since the organization's founding. And Trump's crowning achievement, the 2017 tax cuts, which ballooned our federal deficit, that was a policy crafted by Heritage. For 3 years running, in 2018, no, go back to the previous slide was the correct one. For 3 years running, in 2018, 2019, and 2020, the University of Pennsylvania, which produces an annual index of global think tanks, rated Heritage the world's top think tank in terms of impact on public policy. So what impact will Heritage have this time around? Well, that remains to be seen, and it depends largely on what we all here commit to do. But one thing is abundantly clear, and that is this is not your father's Heritage Foundation. Kevin Roberts became president of the Heritage Foundation in October 2021. Since taking the reins, he has adopted far more populist positions in step with the evolution of the Republican Party itself under Donald Trump. One striking shift is in the foreign policy arena. The once hawkish Heritage Foundation surprised many when it opposed U.S. aid to Ukraine. It has also changed its tune on the free market, states' rights, and in countless other ways, some say to remain relevant with the new right. Now, let's drill down on Project 2025, the Foundation's newest policy handbook. Published in April of 2023, earlier than any of its previous presidential policy guidebooks, this is the 9th edition in a series they call their Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. In a January interview with the New York Times, Roberts said the task for Heritage is, quote, institutionalizing Trumpism through Project 2025. Many believe Heritage is actually modeling its vision of America on Orbanism. For years, Roberts and his team have been meeting publicly and privately with Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who has deep ties to Russia. Roberts sings Orban's praises, especially as it relates to his embrace of Christian nationalism, which is interesting because for decades, Orban identified as an agnostic liberal. The European Union, we should note, no longer considers Hungary a functioning democracy. The $22 million plan is an exhaustive 920-page America First book of policy proposals for the next Republican president, presumably Donald Trump. The book provides conservative rationale and recommendations on every major issue facing the country and the apparatus and backing needed to put those policies into effect. According to Axios, Project 2025 is the most sophisticated, expensive pre-transition planning ever undertaken for either party. Heritage, as a nonprofit, cannot explicitly endorse Trump, but it's most certainly written with Trump in mind. More than 140 people who worked for him, including cabinet secretaries, top-ranking White House officials, and senior aides, played key roles in writing it. That fact alone makes Trump's claim that he doesn't know what Project 2025 is or who's behind it one of his most preposterous and brazen lies yet. At a 2022 Heritage Foundation, he endorsed the organization, saying it was, quote, going to lay the groundwork and detail plans for exactly what our movement will do. As knowledge and fear about the plan spread, he was desperately trying to silence the project's leaders and distance himself from the plan. Some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal, he writes on Truth Social. And then, seeming to miss the hypocrisy of it all, he adds, anything they do, I wish them luck. At the center of the plan is increasing and consolidating presidential powers, purging the federal bureaucracy in part by firing as many as 50,000 federal workers, and installing an army of Trump loyalists. Project 2025 leans into what legal scholars refer to as the unitary executive doctrine, which claims that executive power is vested solely in the president, who has broad authority to act alone, rejecting the idea that the government is composed of three separate branches with overlapping powers that serve to provide checks and balances. Here are just some of the policy goals outlined in Project 2025. Defund and overhaul the Department of Justice. The DOJ will no longer be semi-independent. Instead, it would become a political arm of the White House, prosecuting the president's enemies. Dismantle the FBI, which it claims collaborated with Democratic operatives to inject fake stories about Russian collusion into the 2016 election, and is therefore irretrievably compromised by the deep state. Efforts to combat the spread of misinformation will end, and domestic counterterrorism efforts will be greatly curtailed. Now, consider that anti-Semitic and other religious attacks are overwhelmingly committed by right-wing Christian nationalists, and that Donald Trump considers the Christian nationalists who stormed the Capitol heroes. Abolish the Departments of Education and Commerce. Consider here that the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is responsible for investigating and adjudicating allegations of discrimination in public schools, including anti-Semitic discrimination, and that House Republicans recently voted to cut $10 million from the office's funding over culture war issues such as Title IX. Next, they'll give the president complete power over the Federal Communications Commission. So Trump's threats to revoke licenses of networks that criticize him would be taken quite seriously. Re-examine the tradition of providing workspace for the press corps and ensure the White House counsel is, quote, deeply committed to the president's agenda. weaken the EPA and gut climate regulations, repeal the Marriage Equality Act, undo LGBTQ rights and protections from, quote, every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, and piece of legislation that exists, outlaw pornography, and register educators and librarians who, quote, purvey it as sex offenders. Books with same-sex characters would be considered pornography. As the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, Axios, The Hill, and many others describe it in headline after headline, Project 2025 is an all-out assault on democracy, the environment, the role of government, the LGBTQ community, education, and unionized federal workers. Its enemies list, writes opinion columnist Harold Meyerson in the American Prospect, includes scientists, woke bureaucrats, woke educators, woke diplomats, woke generals, woke G-men, and anyone who doesn't indulge the next president's every whim. Paul Dans, the MIT-educated lawyer who directed, and note I used past tense, he directed the Heritage Foundation's presidential transition project and served as chief of staff in the Office of Personnel Management under Trump, but of course Trump didn't know him, was recently forced out. His resignation letter states, quote, "We completed what we set out to do, united behind the cause of deconstructing the administrative state. Our efforts to build a personnel apparatus for policymakers of all levels, federal, state, and local, will continue." The administrative state that Dan's referred to are the people he says prevented Trump from executing his first-term policies, people like Sally Yates and Colonel Alexander Vidman, so-called deep staters who they say must be expelled from civil service and replaced with officials ready to fulfill the president's governing agenda. The archetype of what we want to end in a bureaucrat, Dan said, is none other than Dr. Anthony Fauci. In a recent C-SPAN interview, he proclaimed, "We're not interested in placating leftist agendas in the bureaucracy. We're going to demolish them." That kind of inflammatory language and unbridled us versus them rhetoric erupts from the 920 pages of the Project 2025 handbook. Phrases such as systemic rot are used to describe a woke and corrupt federal bureaucracy that the conservative right must commandeer, reshape, do away with, gut, demolish, destroy, kill. The very first page of the Project 2025 website declares, if we are going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place ready to carry this agenda out on day one of the next conservative administration. The plan calls for an executive branch that functions fully under the command of the president, and it's built on 4 pillars. Pillar 1, mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, which I mentioned, it lays out their governing agenda. Some 450 conservatives from outside of Heritage contributed to the 30-chapter plan that includes in-depth explanations and recommendations for virtually every aspect of the federal government, from the Office of the White House to the Department of Health and Human Services to the intelligence community and beyond. Pillar 2, a personnel database. Project 2025 contracted Oracle, the technology giant founded by billionaire GOP megadonor Larry Ellison, to build a secure personnel database that allows applicants from across the country and from every walk of life to apply to work in the Trump White House online. The idea is to identify a pre-vetted pro-Trump army of up to 54,000 loyalists in legal, judicial, defense, regulatory, and domestic policy jobs. The database currently contains more than 20,000 names, and it's expected to have more than 54,000 names by Inauguration Day. President Roberts says the personnel database is a conservative LinkedIn and the most important part of Project 2025. It's designed to find cabinet secretaries and also the low-level junior staffers and legislative assistants who will become the next generation of Republican leaders. An alumnus of the White House told Axios that the online application questionnaire is designed to test an applicant's MAGA credentials with the emphasis on what applicants believe rather than on their experience or skills. Here are two sample questions. Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? The president should be able to advance his or her agenda through the bureaucracy without hindrance from unelected federal officials. And do you agree or disagree with this statement? Life has a right to legal protection from conception to natural death. Pillar 3. The Presidential Administration Academy, an online educational system that includes workshops, seminars, and mentorship programs designed to train loyalists and tutor future MAGA bureaucrats. Every federal employee would be required to complete the training to be part of the next Republican administration. Pillar 4. The 180-day playbook, which includes draft executive orders, how to write one, how to roll back a regulation, as well as actions to be taken in the first 180 days of the new administration. One of the draft executive orders, according to reporting by the Washington Post, is to invoke the Insurrection Act on day one of a second Trump administration. Based on conversations with a person involved with the plan, as well as internal communications reviewed by the Post, the military would be dispatched to quell potential, or I should say anticipated demonstrations over new Trump policies and planned prosecutions of former Trump supporters turned critics, such as John Kelly, Ty Cobb, and Mark Milley, among others. A heritage official denies the claim. However, there's now abundant evidence that retribution is a major part of the plan. It's also abundantly clear that Project 2025 is a unified effort to take over the levers of power at 12 noon on January 20, 2025, and keep it. Underpinning the entire Project 2025 operation is a well-financed advisory board made up of roughly 110 conservative organizations, up from 80 just a few months ago. Here's an earlier list of advisory board members. Now, some of these organizations are well-known and well-established. You may recognize some of the names, which are listed here in alphabetical order. Now, I'm going to tell you about just two that have been around for decades. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was established in 1973, the very same year as the Heritage Foundation, and by the very same conservative activist who co-founded the Heritage Foundation. The building blocks of this movement were patiently set in motion over 50 years ago. ALEC plays an enormous role in what laws are introduced and ultimately passed by state houses across the country. The Republican lawmakers involved in ALEC, and yes, they're all Republicans, meet regularly with corporate partners and other special interests to craft model legislation. These are pre-packaged bills that are introduced, often word for word, by state legislators. It happens a lot in Pennsylvania. Approximately 200 of these model bills become law every year. These are laws designed to benefit corporate or conservative interests and are often written with or by big oil, big pharma, and other global corporations. And they're often linked to controversial social and economic issues, such as reducing environmental regulations and corporate taxes, or preventing cities from increasing their minimum wage, or blocking common sense gun laws. Florida's Stand Your Ground statute is an example of an ALEC bill. Another prominent group behind Project 2025 is the Heartland Institute, founded in 1984. It's a conservative think tank best known for denying both the scientific consensus on climate change and the major health risks associated with cigarette smoking. And yes, That was a real billboard erected by Heartland featuring the Unabomber. Heartland worked with Philip Morris throughout the 1990s to discredit the science on secondhand smoke and against smoking bans. Now, those are just two of the well-established organizations partnering with Project 2025. There are now dozens of new, equally unsavory organizations in the mix. These are organizations that Raymond Struck of OTT calls new right think tanks, groups driven to achieve the political goals of their wealthy patrons, and not so much anymore policies derived from any actual research or analysis. Many of these new right think tanks are headed up by former Trump officials. According to the New York Times and Accountable US, nearly half of the Project 2025 organizations have received dark money contributions from a network of fundraising groups linked to conservative kingpin Leonard Leo, co-chairman of the Federalist Society. Leo, of course, worked hand in glove with Heritage in steering Trump's judicial picks. In 2022, Leo landed a controversial $1.6 billion donation, the largest in political history, from a 91-year-old manufacturing magnate. So there is plenty of dark money to go around. And there are plenty of billionaires providing dark money to Project 2025 organizations. Charles Koch, the Coors and Scaife families, Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, the Bradleys, and others. Let's take a look at a few of the partner organizations linked to Donald Trump. The Conservative Partnership Institute, CPI, was founded in 2017. Mark Meadows, Trump's last chief of staff, I should say, and a key figure in the effort to overturn the 2020 election, is a senior partner in CPI. Its stated purpose, the professional development of conservative staffers and elected officials. Now, one immediate task these new right think tanks have set for themselves is strengthening the skills of younger party loyalists and training them to be the new party elites. According to Jonathan Swain of the New York Times and Ariba Shah of Salon, CPI has grown sixfold under Meadows' leadership, becoming, quote, the nerve center of the MAGA movement. The group works in battleground states on changing voting rules that would advantage Republican candidates, and it champions the careers of young MAGA loyalists such as Marjorie Taylor Greene. Incidentally, Cleta Mitchell, who's pictured there, who runs the euphemistically named Election Integrity Network at CPI, was on the perfect Trump telephone call to pressure Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger into finding 11,780 votes. This past March, Paul Schwartzman of the Washington Post reported that in just 1 year, CPI snatched up $41 million of real estate in Washington, D.C., 9 buildings located within blocks of the U.S. Capitol, plus another 4 commercial properties with adjoining row houses on or adjacent to Pennsylvania Avenue. Grid News says shell companies are behind the purchases, and CPI refers to this string of properties as a campus it calls Patriots Row. What are they up to? CPI also owns a 2,200-acre compound known as a conservative Camp David near the Eastern Shore in Cambridge, Maryland, where conservatives meet, all the people involved in this organization, for staff training and, quote, to strategize and unite. So those two organizations are part of the old guard. But let me tell you about conservative think tanks born in the Trump era. Starting with America First Legal, AFL, established in 2021. The founder and president of American First Legal is Stephen Miller. Miller was senior advisor to Donald Trump and director of White House speechwriting, and famously the architect of Trump's first-term immigration policies, including family separation. Now, it's worth noting that Mark Meadows and Russ Boyd, someone I'll tell you about in a bit, are both board members of America First Legal. CPI contributed millions of dollars to them. In fact, many of the organizations on the Project 2025 board are deeply connected. As the Washington Post puts it, several were incubated by CPI. Miller describes America First Legal as, quote, the long-awaited answer to the ACLU. AFL has successfully filed dozens of federal lawsuits to undo Biden administration policies that addressed racial disparities, supported LGBTQ rights, and expanded early voting. The Washington Post describes AFL as, quote, part of a constellation of groups led by Trump allies that are creating an administration in waiting. And according to Axios, Miller is expected to land a senior role in a second Trump administration. Based on conversations with Miller, the New York Times reports that Trump's 2025 immigration plans would expand and toughen policies carried out in his first term. We're talking detention camps, large-scale arrests, mass deportations, including of those who have been in the country for years or even decades, quote, on a scale unseen in modern American history. Bigger, Trump says, than the so-called Operation Wetback carried out by the Eisenhower administration. Mike Davis, who was chief counsel for nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee during Trump's first 2 years in office, has been floated as a candidate for Attorney General in a second Trump administration. If he's selected, he promises, quote, a 3-week reign of terror. We're going to put kids in cages. It's going to be glorious, he said. Then there's the Center for Renewing America, started in 2021 and led by Trump appointee Russell Vought, a Christian nationalist and former head of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. Vought wrote Chapter 2 of the handbook, Executive Office of the President of the United States. It's a how-to manual for purging the civil service. Here he is in a secretly recorded video explaining Project 2025's plans and Trump's knowledge and support of them. He thinks he's talking to family members of a big donor, but he's actually talking to a journalist and an actor working undercover for the UK-based Center for Climate Reporting.
This year has been predominantly now getting ready for a year 5 of a Trump administration. We have about 350 different documents that are regulations and things of that nature.
And of course, Trump knows nothing.
I don't know what the hell it is. It's Project 25.
And Vought is unfazed.
Notwithstanding, I expect you to hear 10 more times from the rally, the president, distancing himself from the left's boogeyman of Project 2025.
Yeah. And you're not worried about that?
I'm not worried about it. He's very supportive of what we do.
He's not only supportive, he gives it his blessing, and he has done fundraisers for Vought's organization. Now, Vought was behind Trump's controversial, I think we want to go back one slide, executive order known as Schedule F, which was signed into law in October of 2020, with less than 3 months left in the Trump presidency. Schedule F called for reclassifying thousands of federal employees as political appointees, stripping them of civil service protections, thereby making them at-will employees fireable by the president. In the final days of Trump's term, government agencies were instructed to identify and transfer employees into this new job classification. Vought identified 425 OMB employees. We're talking 88% of his workforce for Schedule F. The fear, of course, was that Trump loyalists would sabotage Biden's administration by firing employees responsible for key government services just ahead of his inauguration. And they did do some funny things there, I'll say. There was intense pushback from federal employee groups and other stakeholders who urged Congress to step in and block the executive order, which was never implemented. Nonetheless, Vogt told The Atlantic in September of 2023 that, quote, mere talk of Schedule F resulted in a cultural change at the department. Employees were understanding, he said, that there could be consequences for their resistance. One of the first things President Biden did after taking office was rescind Schedule F, but reimposing it is at the top of Project 2025's to-do list. Russ Vought and John McEntee are leading that charge. Now, McEntee was Trump's former body man and personal aide. Let's go to that slide. Yeah, until he was fired in 2018 by Sean Kelly, citing security clearance concerns. McEntee apparently had a gambling problem that made him a security risk. 2 months ago, this gem of a human being sparked backlash and an FBI investigation for posting an outrageous video boasting about giving homeless people fake money. So, quote, when they use it, they get arrested. So, like, I'm actually like helping clean up the community, you know? I guess that's right-wing problem solving. After Kelly's departure, Trump rehired McEntee and named him White House Director for Presidential Personnel, yes, in charge of rooting out and firing Trump critics. It's not enough to get the personnel right, says McEntee. What's necessary is a complete system overhaul. A complete system overhaul is exactly what Mandy Gunasekara, Chief of Staff in Trump's first-term EPA, wants the next Republican administration to do to the Environmental Protection Agency. Gunasekara wrote Project 2025's chapter on the EPA. She calls climate change, quote, a perceived threat and a pseudo-religion that the left is overstating. The climate data she's observed, she doesn't say where, suggests, quote, a mild and manageable climate change in the future. Her policy plan would completely gut climate research and undo every federal clean energy program aimed at curbing greenhouse gas pollution from cars, power plants, and oil and gas wells. An EPA advisor would instead pivot to serving the needs of the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot more to that I don't have time to get to. This is Roger Severino. He headed up the civil rights enforcement in the Department of Health and Human Services in the Trump administration, the division that's supposed to protect marginalized communities from discrimination. Instead, the social conservative and devout Catholic rolled back healthcare protections for the LGBT community. He has a long history of relentlessly trying to roll back hard-won reproductive rights, opposing gay marriage, and defending conversion therapy. In Chapter 14, Department of Health and Human Services, Severino urges the next conservative president to, quote, maintain a biblically based, social science reinforced definition of marriage and family. In other words, a legitimate family is comprised of a married mother and father and their children. Opposition to COVID-19 policies, he writes, galvanized conservative Christians. He writes, how much mitigation is worth the price of shutting down churches on the holiest day of the Christian calendar and far beyond, as happened in 2020? What is the proper balance of lives saved versus souls saved? Now that the Supreme Court has ended the federal right to abortion, Severino says the FDA is ethically and legally obliged to withdraw approval of mifepristone, which he calls the single greatest threat to unborn children. He proposes that the next HHS secretary immediately reimpose old regulations that required mifepristone be dispensed in person under a doctor's supervision and be available up to 7 weeks gestation, not 10 weeks as it is now. Quote, liberal states have become sanctuaries for abortion tourism, he writes, and he proposes punishing any state that refuses to share information on who gets an abortion, where, when, and why. Severino also discusses reviving the 150-year-old Comstock Act, which criminalized the circulation of, quote, obscene, lewd, or lascivious publications. Using the broadest interpretation of that act, he argues the law would make sending or receiving abortion medication in the mail a crime, and health providers, distributors, and pregnant women themselves could be arrested and prosecuted for sending or receiving them. Now, religious freedom is reinforced throughout Project 2025 playbook. In chapter after chapter, faith, more specifically Christian faith, is at the center of policy recommendations undermining the constitutional separation of church and state. Trump is now above the law, but Americans will be following Christian law. Page 13 of the playbook, for example, reads, when the founder spoke of pursuit of happiness, what that meant might be understood today as, in essence, pursuit of blessedness. That is, an individual must be free to live as his creator ordained. Can blessed be the fruit be that far off? I mean, we are talking the Handmaid's Tale here. And that brings us to Jonathan Berry. He served as chief counsel on Trump's transition team and was later named assistant secretary in the U.S. Department of Labor. Berry wrote Chapter 18, Department of Labor, providing perhaps the most vivid example of the merging of policy and religion. Quote, God ordained the Sabbath as a day of rest, he writes, and until very recently, the Judeo-Christian tradition sought to honor that mandate by moral and legal regulation of work on that day. He then proposes that Congress, quote, encourage communal rest by amending the Fair Labor Standards Act to require that workers be paid time and a half for hours worked on the Sabbath. And of course, we're talking Sunday, arguing that higher costs would reduce work on Sundays and help get Americans back to church. I mentioned earlier that recruiting and mentoring the next generation of Republicans is a top priority. Well, Project 2025 reaches young conservatives through Turning Point USA, founded in 2012 by the young, brash MAGA star Charlie Kirk. Believed to be the fastest growing organization of campus chapters in America, Turning Point USA identifies, educates, trains, and organizes conservative students and boasts a presence on more than 3,500 college and high school campuses nationwide. Perhaps best known for its professor watch list, which purports to expose professors who, quote, discriminate against conservative students and advance leftist propaganda in the classroom. Those named to the list routinely report being victims of intimidation, harassment, and even sexual assault and death threats. Politico says the professor watch list is riddled with errors, and Slate reports that Turning Point admits that anyone can report a staff member without evidence. The New York Times describes the site as a threat to academic freedom, and Inside Higher Education has compared the list to a new form of McCarthyism. And yes, for those Penn Staters in the audience, Penn State professors are on the list. Now, TPUSA added a school board watch list to its portfolio in 2021. The names and photos of school board members who engage in so-called dangerous agendas are posted to the website. Dangerous agendas can include the way history, race, and concepts around gender and sex are taught in school, to supporting mask and/or vaccine mandates. And that brings us to education. Here's a clip of Kevin Roberts on the subject of the Department of Education, which we actually heard earlier. We heard it at the beginning, so they were played out of order, but we'll play it again.
But as you might imagine, I have a personal favorite, and that is, once and for all, We are going to eliminate, tear out, root and branch the most rotten part of the federal government, which is the U.S. Department of Education.
That gets a rousing applause, which is startling to me. Now, Chapter 11, the Department of Education, was written by Lindsay Burke. Here she is here, Chief of the Heritage Foundation's Center for Education Policy. Her 44-page chapter on the conservative plan for education is simple. Abolish the Department of Education as we know it, dispense with all current rules and regulations, especially as they apply to the LGBTQ community. Burke argues for a future in which teachers are gagged, education is publicly funded, but education decisions are made by families. The federal government provides no oversight or accountability for how taxpayer dollars are spent beyond perhaps certifying a certain minimum level of quality among providers. These universal vouchers are used in Arizona, especially among the wealthy, and are already leading to public school closures. They'd be portable, no strings attached, and available to all students. But private and religious schools would be free to, quote, control their admissions. In other words, reject any students deemed too difficult or expensive to serve. Burke advocates for tax credit scholarships that were pushed by Betsy DeVos during her tenure as Secretary of Education. Now, these tax credits would allow wealthy donors to fund private schools in lieu of paying taxes. Now, I've covered just 5 of the 30 chapters in Project 2025 and only a handful of the 110 partner organizations. So that is a small sampling of what's fueling the right and animating the plans for a second Trump presidency. But against this backdrop is a presidential candidate who last September posted this warning to Biden on Truth Social. Republicans are already thinking about what we're going to do to Biden and the communists when it's our turn. Now, of course, that would be changed to Kamala. And on Good Friday, of all days, Donald Trump posted a video of 2 MAGA pickup trucks in Long Island, New York. The lift gate on one of the trucks features a life-size image of a bound and hog-tied President Biden lying on the truck bed floor. Newspapers around the world reported that a former president, a candidate for re-election to that same office, was promoting his opponent at the time as kidnapped and held prisoner. In a June speech at the Faith and Freedom Coalition conference, our former president declares, "I am your warrior. I am your justice. I am your retribution." A few minutes later, he vows to, quote, totally obliterate the so-called deep state. In a Veterans Day speech in Claremont, New Hampshire this past November, Trump doubled down on his message of vengeance and grievance. Quote, "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections." He even refers to himself as, quote, "a very proud election denier." They'll do anything, he continues, whether legally or illegal, to destroy America and to destroy the American dream. The threat from outside forces, and now he's referring to Russia, China, and North Korea, is far less sinister than the threat from within. Meanwhile, the currently incarcerated Steve Bannon, whose War Room podcast has become the media home of Project 2025, hosts a steady stream of Project 2025 partners. Here, he's pictured with Jeffrey Clark, a senior fellow and director of litigation at the Center for Renewing America. In this episode, Clark says that an independent DOJ is, quote, ridiculous, it's unconstitutional, and who cares about post-Watergate norms? Here, before his exile, Paul Dans thanks Bannon for his service to the cause. And for his part, Bannon opines in the December 5th episode of War Rooms about exacting revenge on Trump's critics, including government officials and journalists. Quote, "I want the Morning Joe producers that watch us and the producers that watch us. This is not just rhetoric. We're absolutely dead serious. We're going to come after you. Now, the reaction to this rhetoric shows up in headlines like these. Donald Trump's dictator promise is no joke, says Vanity Fair. A Trump dictatorship is increasingly inevitable. We should stop pretending, writes the Washington Post Robert Kagan, the neoconservative turned independent. Stephen Levitsky, a professor of government at Harvard and co-author of How Democracies Die, writes, I'm hard-pressed to find any candidates anywhere who are so open that they would use the power of the state to go after critics and enemies. In a December town hall in Iowa, Fox News host Sean Hannity decided to take the dictator question head on. He bluntly asked Trump, they want to call you a dictator. To be clear, do you in any way have any plans whatsoever, if elected president, to abuse power, to break the law, to use the government to go after people? Trump infamously replied, except for day one. The next day on War Room, Steve Bannon called Hannity an idiot. This is a war, he said, and we don't have time for sunshine patriots. A few days later, the Washington Post's Philip Bump noted, for many Americans, a turn toward authoritarianism isn't seen as a negative. The reason Trump is doing well in the polls at the moment is not simply that people are unfamiliar with his stated authoritarian intentions, should he be inaugurated in January 2025. It's also that a lot of people support those intentions. Mull that over for a minute. The Heritage Foundation's detailed strategy is published online for all to read at www.project2025.org/policy/. The first Trump administration's incompetence may have saved us from the depths of their malevolence. We will have no such luck if there's a next time. Christian nationalists are not a majority of Americans. We can stop them. As Michelle Obama said on day 2 of the Democratic National Convention, if we're to elect Kamala Harris president in November, we all have to do something. Knock doors, donate, put up a yard sign, write a letter to the editor, encourage the voters in your life to learn more about Project 2025 by sharing this video. As the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and investigative journalist Maria Ressa told Politico recently, we will know whether democracy lives or dies by the end of 2024. I'm motivated and optimistic, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an amazing presentation, Patty. I'm going to turn it over to Mitch, who will have a few questions for you. If anybody in the audience has a question for Patty, please put it into the chat now, and we will try to get to that question. But I'm going to begin with Mitch.
So the one thing that they didn't plan for in Project 2025 is us. They didn't plan for us. And we are going to stop this. Everybody watching this video, the people that we share this with, the folks that are on the ground in every state across this country, fighting for democracy, fighting for personal freedom, they did not plan for us. Patty, I want to thank you again for taking the time to share this incredibly important and powerful presentation with folks. This is definitely something that we do not want to keep to ourselves. And, you know, as I said at the beginning of this program, only a couple of short few months ago, not many people knew about Project 2025, but they're learning about it quickly. And we all have a responsibility to talk about parts of it, all of it, every little bit of it, to make sure that people are aware of what the alternative is to Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So I'm sure that people have questions. I know it's been a long night. Some people are probably digesting this. Their heads are spinning. I remember the first time I heard this, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So let's take a few questions from folks. if
Yeah,
you
I'd
would.
like to make a comment.
Sure.
This is absolutely nonsense. Nobody's going to read.
I can't hear him, but maybe you muted him.
Yeah, we did.
Oh.
David, you're muted. David, you muted
Absolute
yourself.
nonsense. I mean, it's in writing. There's nothing nonsense about it. It's in writing.
Yeah. Al, you had your hand.
I'd like to make a comment.
Actually, please put the questions in the chat. We would prefer the questions, if you do have a question. It makes it easier for us if it's put in the chat, because a lot of people may want to speak. We can't see hands raised, that kind of thing with so many people. So if you do have a question, we want the question, but we put it in the chat. So please put, I see Al, you have, please put your question in the chat. What is the, Patty, I see a question in here. How does Project 2025 resonate with minority groups and minority religious groups?
I can't tell you myself. I don't know. I've presented this 6 or 7 times, and the groups are there's not a lot of diversity in the groups I've presented to so far. A little, but not much. And so and as I've read literally for months about Project 2025, I haven't seen, specific articles about the impact on ethnic minorities or religious minorities beyond the Jewish community, but it's out there, I'm sure.
I actually have a question. If you were advising the Harris-Walz administration on how to deal with Project 2025, what would you tell them to do?
I think part of the problem is that people don't believe some of what they're saying. You've got Donald Trump denying things. So I think they need to keep presenting the fact that no, like the dinner he went to with Project 2020 with Kevin Roberts and Donald Trump, if he says I didn't do this or I don't know what it is often enough, I can't tell you on X, for example, people believe that he doesn't know anything about it. So I think you need to convince people that this is real and maybe approach them with something that they're interested in. If education, if they're a school teacher, for example, show them specific parts. This is broken up into 30 chapters. No one's going to become an expert on all 30 chapters, but if you're a union worker, the labor section is one that you'd want to share with people. But I don't know. I think it's hard for Kamala Harris because no matter what they say, he denies.
Yeah, if I see Craig and Al, please put the question in the chat. That would be great. Thank you. If you could put whatever the question is in the chat.
I just had a comment raised by a person who mentioned minority groups, so I'd like to respond if I could.
Please.
Go ahead.
Okay, I belong to a fraternity, and what we're doing, we're going to be coming up with a handout, and our chapters in the Montgomery County area, and we're going to be going into the African American Latino community with handouts with bulleted points to get them educated. So that's what some of us are doing.
Yeah, that's great.
Patty, if somebody wants you to do this presentation for them, for another group, whether it's a group of educators, a union group, a church group, how do they reach out to you?
You can share my email address if you want.
Okay, I'll put that in the email. Just so everyone's aware, you will receive a video of tonight's presentation. And I'll include it in that contact information for Patty if you would like her to do a program for your group, and I'm sure if she is able and available, she will do that. But you will get a video, and if for some reason you don't get our email, it'll be put up this evening on the DJOP YouTube channel. I know there are people from many states here, so please feel free to share the video. I think the more we spread the word, the better. It encompasses all areas of life, from the environment to abortion to simply government functioning.
You know, I just want to add that, you know, for dreamers and for the Hispanic community, I mean, there are dreamers who would be uprooted, who have lived here, have only known the United States basically as home, that under Trump's plan, they will be deported. And there's evidence to suggest that if Trump does the three things he promises, which is increase tariffs across the board, mass deportation, and tax cuts for the rich, we will, by mid-2025, be in a deep recession. That's something that the Harris campaign should be pushing.
I think we're going to conclude at this point. It's been a long evening. Thank you for staying on. When you get the video, you know, you can use the slides, you know, in shorter versions to send to people. If there's specific tidbits you think are important or would resonate, you know, I think we are our own best advocates. I was lucky enough to be a delegate, and I got to hear Michelle Obama say, do something, and Mitch said it as well. These are our marching orders. Let's share the information we learn. Let's spread it far and wide. The more people who know about the dangers of not just Trump, but Trumpism and the far right in the Republican Party, the better off we'll be, and the more likely we will be able to win in November. So thank you for being here.
You are dominating the meeting. You're not leaving time for.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Okay, good night.